Vampires have been a creature in myth form for thousands of years, originating in Eastern Europe and very much a local legend to the Slavic people, but over the centuries the idea of vampires and their mythos has increasingly intrigued people across the globe, spreading and evolving these ideas until 1897. This year is pivotal because this is the year where author Bram Stoker would unleash his new novel to the world, a novel that would bring vampires to the world in a way we've never seen before, a novel that would change the course of fiction, pop culture and history forever. And that novel was called Dracula. Dracula is an essential piece of gothic fiction that widespread the vampire and its tropes across Western pop culture. When somebody says vampire, you likely think Dracula. It has fundamentally shaped the way we understand vampires, the way we perceive them, what we associate them with. It has rendered nearly every other interpretation on the original legend completely moot. Fangs, lack of reflection, garlic running across water, emphasis on crucifixes, creating vampires through a bite, sunlight sensitivity, shape-shifting into animals, that's all Dracula as far as I'm aware, and Stoker also made Dracula more human-like, less beastly. Though he is described as a very decrepit and largely off-putting figure, he is still very much appearing to be human, and the popularity of Dracula stretched very far. I mean, he's still relevant today, but when movies began to become mainstream, you were bound to see an influx of Dracula adaptations, and fun fact, Dracula has been in more movies than any other fictional character. Now, the earliest example of Dracula in film, as far as I can find in my research, is a 1920s Russian film simply titled Dracula. But there is no existing evidence of the film's existence, no stills, no props, and though this isn't completely unheard of, I mean, Martin Scorsese's Film Foundation estimates that more than 90% of movies made before 1929 are considered lost, and the Library of Congress estimates that 75% of all silent films are lost forever. The complete lack of proof on this Dracula adaptation has caused many to question whether the film ever existed at all. Then a year later, in 1921, there was another Dracula adaptation called Dracula Halala, which is also considered a lost film, but people generally agree this one did in fact exist. And though this is technically the first on-screen appearance of Dracula, it's believed to not have followed the story of the novel nearly at all, more so an adaptation of the character rather than the novel. But adaptations of Dracula aren't the only vampires in film. Earlier than both of those movies, a short film called The Vampire, made in 1913, directed by Robert G. Vignola, is also cited as one of the first vampire movies ever made. It was based on the 1987 poem The Vampire by Rudyard Kipling, which itself was based on the painting The Vampire by Philip Burne-Jones. The problem being, this doesn't portray vampires exactly how we see them today. In fact, it isn't really about vampires at all in any recognizable sense, more so vamps, or as we so commonly call them now, femme fatales, though it can probably be cited as the first vampire film depending on who you ask. This movie is not considered lost, unlike the two later Dracula adaptations, as there is one print that exists in the George Eastman Museum Film Archive, and there's also a film of the same title, The Vampire, which released 3 years earlier in 1910 but is considered a lost film and is based on the same painting and poem. And there's a couple other noteworthy topics of discussion, such as a 1986 French film titled The Devil's Castle in the US or The Haunted Castle in the UK, which can actually be found on YouTube. This film can actually be cited as the first ever horror film, and some argue it's the first vampire film as it features a bat that transforms into a man in a cape. Now, what's notable about this to me more than anything is that it predates the novel of Dracula by 11 years, and though I would say it's a stretch to call it the first vampire movie, I think it's pretty cool nonetheless. Now, forgive me for this history lesson and frankly crude research. There isn't a lot available about a lot of these movies, and information about them is very scattered and questionable, but I say all of this to say in 1922 we would be given what isn't the first vampire film or even the first Dracula adaptation, but we do get the foundation of every Dracula adaptation since, every vampire movie since, and every horror movie made ever since, and that movie would be called
Nosferatu.
Unlike the other Dracula adaptations, you'll notice this movie wasn't named Dracula, or doesn't even feature the word at all in the movie, and that's because Nosferatu was an unauthorized adaptation. Nosferatu, the word, comes from the archaic Romanian word meaning the offensive one or the insufferable one. Notably, the production company of Nosferatu was sued for plagiarism, and Stoker's estate won and had all copies of the film destroyed. Except 5, one of which made it to the US for a screening in 1929, which had kept the film alive for decades until recent restorations that have also taken moments from other surviving copies from around the world to fill in the blanks. It's insane to think what the world would be without this movie in it, and that world was very nearly a reality. Now obviously, with it being an unauthorized adaptation, a lot of the movie's details were changed to avoid plagiarism complaints, even if successful, so let's look at some of the differences made in the attempt to subvert any copyright issues from the Bram Stoker Dracula novel. First of all, the setting of the movie has been switched from 1890s Britain to 1838 Germany. This switch doesn't do a whole lot to change the story, nothing at all really. The biggest issue with this would usually be the cast and language, but since this is a silent film, images don't need translating. Plus, with the time period, the movie and book both stick to old villages, and most of Europe around that time had a similar look when it comes to small towns and countryside, so it's a negligible difference if you ask me. Honestly, if you didn't already know, it's likely you would never really know from watching the movie anyway. Okay, so these next changes are a little more important and noticeable, namely the fact that Nosferatu removes a few characters and changes the names of those who remain. Like Mina and Jonathan Harker have been renamed to Ellen and Thomas Hutter. Ellen also now adopts some character traits of Lucy, Dracula's first victim in Britain from the novel, like sleepwalking. Count Dracula is famously renamed to Count Orlok. Van Helsing is renamed to Dr. Bulwer, which is apparently in reference to occult novelist Edward Bulwer Lytton, who wrote a lot of gothic fiction which falls right in line with Nosferatu with its gothic aesthetic, and links to gothic literature like Bram Stoker himself. These changes don't really seem significant in the whole copyright sphere, and they don't change much narratively, but I will admit that I adore the titular vampire isn't Dracula. Though he is clearly meant to be, giving him the name Count Orlok does massively separate him from past and future adaptations of the Dracula character, who mostly depict him as this suave, handsome and silver-tongued count, but Orlok, which is a very sharp and aggressive name already, is a lot more beastly, a lot more creature-defined. Seeing the design of Orlok being imitated later on is definitely more distinct as reference to this movie rather than the novelization of Dracula. Orlok is also now believed to have been created by Belial, an archdemon of Satan, while Dracula was a former voivode who was killed in battle. There's a theory that Belial's link to Orlok hints towards his tendency to practice dark sorcery in pre-death life, since Belial is traditionally summoned by Goetic magic, which is essentially just witchcraft. In Psalm 41 verses 8 through 10, King James's version, Belial is used in reference of disease, and Orlok himself is pestilence incarnate. He brings along rats which pour out of his coffins, which in turn brings the Black Death to Wisborg. Now, though those things happen in Dracula 2, not exactly the Black Plague but contamination, sickness and the rats, this thematic link to biblical pestilence feels a lot more thematically appropriate for the vampire myth than simply being a military general or aristocrat that died and arose after dying in battle. More changes are that Orlok doesn't turn any victims into vampires, he only kills people, unlike Dracula. Dracula is also only weakened by the sun but can freely walk in the daylight. Orlok, however, can be killed by direct sunlight, therefore sleeps during the day and only prowls at night, which is a detail we'll get into later. The ending of the novel also sees Dracula die by beheading and knife to the heart, whereas Orlok's demise comes from Ellen luring Orlok into her room, sacrificing herself so that the Count will get caught by the sunlight and die. Now these last two changes can be committed recommended, as they make a decent effort to deviate from the book, especially in the latter's case. But I think even when considering the narrative, I love them. One, the idea that sunlight can kill a vampire is genius. Giving this impossibly dangerous being a simple weakness like that not only creates intelligent limitations for creative plot points, but also somehow makes him scarier. Knowing there's a specific time when he's around makes him more terrifying somehow, as if there's a clock counting down to when he's unleashed upon the people. And the time he's unleashed is when people are at their most vulnerable, at night where their sight is limited and they're usually asleep. When you are at your weakest, he is there. Then with the change in ending, I'll get into later why I love that so much, but let's now talk about the movie itself for a bit. Now, I watched this recently on this beautiful 16mm copy I have, but you can find this pretty much anywhere, even on YouTube since it entered worldwide public domain in 2019, and even by today's standards, I think the look of this film is absolutely gorgeous. I adore this simple castle design, which is definitely a byproduct of shooting on location, but when putting the real life aura of a castle next to the miniatures and sets built for later movies, this really gets set apart. There is something tangible, something real about these places that bring us into the world of Nosferatu. And the film employs a bunch of techniques to drive home certain effects Orlok has and his presence. These effects were standard filmmaking at the time and may seem cheesy and silly by today's standards, but I think in context, they still work. Like the sped up camera effects, we first see this with the carriages leading up to the castle. All of this gives this preternatural feeling to the grounds immediately. It's something that's presented as diegetic, and because we see a regular carriage just before, we understand as an audience this is something particular and special to Orlok and his grounds. Also, going towards the nature of Orlok is his design and performance from Max Schreck. I'm in love with this design. It's like it's inspired by the book's descriptions of Dracula combined with the scream by Edvard Munch, who also weirdly had a painting titled Love and Pain, which is also known as Vampire. But combining that design with Schreck's performance creates something ghoulish and timeless. Roger Ebert pointed out that the performance is untainted by modern filmmaking techniques, and I think he means that everything is just so controlled now. It has to be, but back then, because there was no big set and there was one stationary camera and no audio was being captured, everything was quite bare. So he could just consume himself in this performance, and he ends up playing Orlok more animal than man. He's much more of a supernatural threat. He's not just a monster but a phantom, an almost cosmic being. So when bringing that design and performance together with the gothic cinematography, we get some images that are still haunting to this day. And its use of shadows is so incredibly clever that silhouettes have been used similarly ever since in horror. And though this shot has been most parodied and copied, I love how the shadows of Orlok grabbing Ellen were homaged in Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula in these scenes. There's also a quote in the movie which says, "Men do not always recognize the dangers that beasts can sense at certain times." And this is a fundamental horror truth. It's one of my rules of any horror movie experience: always trust the animals. And though Nosferatu doesn't invent that idea, it does seem to be the first significant use of the trope in film. The writing, I think, also works very well in tandem with the visuals. Obviously back then a script would include little dialogue, so story progression, emotions and such all had to be communicated non-verbally through the lighting, the shot composition and the performances. Silent movies are the quintessential show not tell movies because they had to be. Even something as simple as Orlok being immediately entranced by the image of Ellen, which is subtle foreshadowing for the final moments. He's transfixed by the image of her neck. He's clearly obsessed with the idea of killing her from the first few interactions between him and Thomas. So when pairing this with these scriptures we find from a book donated to our lead in the beginning, the finale ties in well narratively, and the death of Count Orlok is both expected, a surprise, and most of all, clean. I also just love these images of Count Orlok on the ship. This whole sequence is my favourite. The stop motion, the shadows, the unnatural rising, the terror of the situation, it's beautiful. It does sadly remind me of last year's The Last Voyage of the Demeter. The boat scene in this movie is so quick and visceral, it just saddens me over how much better that movie could have been. It could have taken my favourite sequence from Nosferatu and stretched it to feature length. It had some cool ideas and decent moments, but it was overall forgettable. Anyway, Nosferatu just has that fundamental movie magic, you know, like when you watch a film, as you do often, but one in particular reminds you of why you love them so much. It could be something as innocuous as Nancy Meyers' The Parent Trap. But just look at this scene. Maybe it's just the simple fact of seeing a foundational piece of cinema, blissfully innocent and completely unaware of what its legacy will be, like the smell of olive oil, onion and garlic in a pan, a simple beauty and full of what's to be. And what's to be is a lot of what this movie is remembered for. Its legacy. German Expressionism was prevalent at the time. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari predates this by 2 years, but Nosferatu is the absolute peak of the style, and the first of the style to shoot on location rather than on studio sets. This can also be traced to as the general foundation of art house horror, along with the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is still a huge subgenre today. Plus, German Expressionism is one of the bedrocks of Gothic stylings, as well as Tim Burton, whose entire style relies on films of this style and nature. Burton even names a character in Batman Returns, Max Schreck, who is the actor who brought Count Orlok to life. Nosferatu inspired vampire movies forever, introducing the idea vampires can be killed by sunlight, which is still a prevalent addition to vampire lore to this day. The way Orlok moves, the look of his castle, even the look of Count Orlok himself has been forever linked to vampirism since. Take for example the 2014 horror comedy What We Do in the Shadows, which features a vampire in the name of Peter that's very clearly inspired by Count Orlok. There's been remakes of this movie, imitators of this movie. There's a movie called Shadow of the Vampire in which we follow a fictionalized version of the production of Nosferatu. John Malkovich plays director F.W. Murnau as he makes his masterpiece by casting a real vampire as his titular Count Orlok, who's played by Willem Dafoe. And Dafoe, who was nominated for an Oscar in 2001 for his role as Max Schreck, is now featuring in the 2024 remake of Nosferatu as vampire hunter Professor Albin Eberhard von Franz, being directed by folk horror and new age gothic great Robert Eggers. But even outside of vampire movies, there's the art house horror we discussed, Burton, folk horror, and its use of practical effects has had an impact on every genre's approach to practical effects work since, and the influence of a piece like this simply cannot be measured. All the way down to these SpongeBob gags, which are so funny to be in a cartoon for children who just simply won't get the reference. I will say though, his image did freak me out as a kid, even with this ghoulish smile, which does speak to the inherent haunting image of this character. And yes, this film introduced tropes of vampirism and the aesthetics of horror moving forward, but also remember that Ellen is also the one to defeat Orlok in the movie, as opposed to the novel where it's two men, hinting at the trend of women being the heroes of horror. The final girl is a trope that became heavily dominant in the 70s and beyond, but even back to the early 1920s, women have been saving the day as marked by this film. And you know, horror has evolved over the years. This is not scary in the traditional sense anymore. It's the burden of being the foundation of something. People will build upon you, and usually that's what makes people marvel. In horror, people have built upon the ideas of this movie to the point where we don't even recognize this as the same product. Small touches, ideas so fundamental they seem useless, is a quote from This Is How You Lose the Time War, and I think it is endlessly applicable to this movie. Over the 100 plus years since Nosferatu's release, the horror genre has evolved and picked up new traits and cliches and other foundational pieces to make up its modern DNA. But the atmospheric horror of Nosferatu is not only a building block for something in the vein of a Skinamarink, Rosemary's Baby, Cure, or any number of Yorgos Lanthimos movies, it's still effective in leaving an impression. This film may not outright scare a modern audience, but it will still haunt one, which is undeniably impressive, and its legacy, combined with its evergreen quality, will have it remain as one of the greatest movies ever made. But that's just me. Have you seen Nosferatu? If so, let me know what you think of it. If not, will you? And whether it's one that has changed the fundamentals of vampires, horror, and cinema as a whole or not. as always, keep watching movies.